The night Sammy Davis Jr. walked into that Vegas casino in 1957, he had no idea he was signing away his entire life. The lights were bright, the champagne was flowing, and everyone wanted a piece of the greatest entertainer in America. But in a back room, behind velvet curtains and cigar smoke, three men in perfectly tailored suits were waiting. They weren't there to celebrate. They were there to collect. What happened in that room would haunt Sammy Davis Jr. for the next 3 decades. A debt so deep, so dangerous, that even Frank Sinatra couldn't pull him out. This is the story Hollywood never wanted you to hear. 1957 was supposed to be Sammy's golden year. At just 31 years old, he was already a phenomenon. When he danced, when he sang, when he played the trumpet, the entire world held its breath. He was a black man, standing at the very top of a white industry, and nobody could touch his talent. But that night was different. As he walked through the marble corridors of the casino, surrounded by sycophants, twisting women and waiters offering endless drinks, something gnawed at him. Everyone wanted a photo, an autograph, just a moment of his attention. Sammy smiled, but his eyes told another story. There was tension, a desperate need to escape. Then a hand landed on his shoulder. Heavy, cold, authoritative. A voice behind him spoke with robotic precision, informing him that people upstairs were waiting. Sammy turned. The man in the suit stared at him with empty eyes, but the message was clear. This was not an invitation, it was an order. Sammy's stomach twisted, because he knew exactly who those people were, and he knew that what waited for him upstairs would not be a simple conversation. The upstairs room felt like a luxurious dungeon. Dark wooden walls, the scent of expensive cigars hanging in the air, the lights were dim, but a crystal whiskey bottle gleamed in the corner. Three men sat at the table, drinks in hand, emotionless smiles on their faces. The man in the center spoke. His voice was soft, but every word carried the weight of a threat. He told Sammy to sit, that they needed to talk. Sammy sat. His legs trembled, but the stage smile remained plastered on his face. It wasn't genuine. It was a survival reflex. The man leaned back, reminding Sammy of everything they had done for him. They had opened the doors of Las Vegas. They had arranged his shows. They had protected him. But now Sammy had a debt to pay. Sammy swallowed hard and asked how much. The man took a deep drag from his cigar and exhaled slowly. $150,000. And that was just the beginning. The number exploded in Sammy's mind like a bomb. In 1957, that amount was a fortune. Maybe $2 million in today's money. And Sammy had no chance of paying it. Every dollar he earned was already going to the studio, his manager, the IRS. But the real shock was something else entirely. Sammy insisted he owed them nothing. He was just performing shows. He hadn't gambled, hadn't borrowed money. One of the men, seated on the right, leaned forward. He explained to Sammy that they decided who owed what in this town. From the moment Sammy set foot in their casino, he became indebted because they protected him. They kept him alive. And now that protection had a price. From that moment on, Sammy Davis Jr. quotes, life became a nightmare. Every dollar he earned, every night he performed, every contract he signed now belonged to them. The mob didn't see him as an investment. They saw him as property. After his shows, Sammy was summoned to private rooms. Other wealthy men, politicians, businessmen were there. Sammy was forced to dance, to sing, to smile for them for free, because he was paying off his debt. But the debt never decreased. In fact, it grew larger with each passing year. Interest, protection fees, service charges, everything was a trap. One night in 1959, Sammy went to his studio manager. His face was pale, dark circles under his eyes. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. On stage he kept smiling, but inside he was dying. He begged the manager to get him out, pleading that these people were destroying him. The manager sat behind his desk, crossed his arms, and shrugged. He admitted he couldn't help Sammy because he was afraid of them too. Even Frank Sinatra couldn't intervene. Everyone thought Sinatra had power in Las Vegas. But the truth was different. The mob controlled even Sinatra, and saving Sammy would mean risking Sinatra's own life. Once, in 1960, Sinatra told Sammy something that broke him. He said he loved Sammy, but you couldn't fight these men. Just try to survive. Forget the rest. That day, Sammy understood something crucial. Nobody could save him. Not his family, not his friends, not even the celebrities. Because in Las Vegas, the real power belonged to the mob. And once they had you, they never let go. But what was truly horrifying was what Sammy did to try to pay off this debt. In the years that followed, he sold his house. He sold his jewelry. He sold his cars. But it still wasn't enough. Finally, backstage, where nobody knew, he made a deal that would destroy him forever. By 1960, Sammy Davis Jr. had become a ghost of himself. The man who once commanded stages with explosive energy now walked with his head down, shoulders hunched under invisible weight. His smile, once genuine and infectious, had become a painted mask he wore for survival. The mob had expanded their demands. It wasn't just about money anymore. They wanted control over every aspect of his life. Where he performed, who he associated with, even who he married. When Sammy began dating Swedish actress May Britt, a white woman, the backlash was immediate and vicious. The mob didn't care about his personal happiness. They cared about optics, about maintaining their carefully controlled image of Las Vegas. Interracial relationships threatened that image. One night, Sammy received a phone call. The voice on the other end was calm, almost friendly, but the message was clear as crystal. The voice suggested it would be unfortunate if something happened to May. The caller mentioned how fragile movie careers could be, how easily accidents could occur on film sets, how quickly a promising actress could disappear from the public eye. Sammy's blood ran cold. He knew exactly what they meant. These weren't empty threats. These were promises wrapped in velvet. He married May Britt anyway in 1960, but the wedding became another chain around his neck. The mob used it as leverage, reminding him constantly that his wife's safety depended on his cooperation. The debt continued to grow. By 1962, the original amount had somehow ballooned to over $300,000. Sammy couldn't understand the math. Every payment he made seemed to disappear into a black hole, swallowed by mysterious fees and accumulating interest. His performances became increasingly desperate. He worked 7 nights a week, sometimes doing 3 shows in a single night. His body began to break down. His voice grew hoarse. His knees, damaged from decades of dancing, screamed in pain with every movement. But he couldn't stop, because stopping meant consequences he didn't want to imagine. Backstage, crew members noticed the change. The vibrant, joking Sammy had been replaced by a hollow-eyed man who chain-smoked between sets and drank to numb the constant anxiety. His dressing room, once filled with laughter and friends, became a lonely sanctuary where he sat in silence, staring at his reflection. One makeup artist later recalled finding Sammy alone before a show, tears streaming down his face. When she asked what was wrong, he simply shook his head and whispered that some debts could never be paid, no matter how hard you tried. The breaking point came in 1964. Sammy was performing at the Sands Hotel when he collapsed on stage mid-song. The audience gasped as he crumpled to the floor, his body finally giving out after years of relentless abuse. He was rushed to the hospital. Doctors discovered severe exhaustion, malnutrition, and signs of a stress-induced ulcer. They ordered him to rest for at least 3 months. But rest wasn't an option. 2 days after being released from the hospital, still weak and pale, Sammy was back on stage, because the men in the back room had made it clear that his health problems were not their concern. The debt didn't take sick days. Frank Sinatra visited him during this time. The 2 men sat in Sammy's dressing room, and for the first time Sinatra saw the full extent of what was happening. Sammy's hands trembled as he lit a cigarette. His eyes were vacant, defeated. Sinatra tried to offer comfort, suggesting that maybe there was a way out, someone they could talk to. But Sammy just laughed. A bitter, hollow sound that didn't match the joyful performer the world knew. He explained to Sinatra that there was no way out. The mob owned him. They owned his past, his present, and his future. Every breath he took was borrowed time. What the public never knew was that Sammy had been forced into other arrangements to satisfy his debt. He became a courier of sorts, carrying messages and packages between mob associates. He was made to perform at private parties where illegal activities took place, his presence legitimizing gatherings that law enforcement might otherwise investigate. His fame became a shield for criminal operations. Who would suspect illegal dealings at an event where Sammy Davis Jr. was entertaining guests? He hated every moment of it. Each compromise chipped away at his soul, transforming the proud entertainer into a puppet dancing on strings pulled by invisible hands. In 1965, during a recording session, a producer noticed something disturbing. Between takes, Sammy sat motionless, staring at nothing. When asked if he was ready to continue, he responded in a flat, emotionless voice that sent chills through everyone in the studio. He said he was always ready, that being ready was all he knew how to be anymore. Because if he wasn't ready, if he hesitated even for a moment, everything would collapse. The producer later told a journalist, off the record, that it was like watching a man who had forgotten how to be human, who had been reduced to pure function. By the late 1960s, Sammy's debt had supposedly been paid multiple times over, but the mob kept finding new reasons to extend it. A late payment here, an added fee there. Interest on interest until the numbers became meaningless. The truth was, they never intended to let him go. He was too valuable, too controllable. As long as he believed he owed them something, they could keep him on their leash. Sammy began drinking heavily. Not socially, not for fun, but to survive. Alcohol became the only way he could quiet the screaming in his mind, the constant anxiety that followed him everywhere. His marriage to May Britt crumbled under the pressure. She could see him drowning and felt powerless to help. They divorced in 1968, another casualty of the invisible war Sammy was fighting. Friends from his early days barely recognized him. The quick-witted, energetic performer had been replaced by a haunted man who jumped at shadows and measured every word before speaking. Dean Martin, part of the Rat Pack, once commented privately that Sammy had lost something essential, some spark that made him who he was. It was like watching a brilliant light slowly dim until only a flicker remained. The 1970s brought no relief. If anything, the pressure intensified. The mob's grip on Las Vegas was being challenged by corporate interests and law enforcement investigations. They squeezed their assets harder, extracting every possible dollar. Sammy was forced to take on increasingly degrading performances. Shows in rundown venues, appearances at events he would have refused years earlier. His pride, once his defining characteristic, had been systematically destroyed. In 1972, a journalist managed to corner Sammy for an interview. She asked him about rumors of financial troubles, about why someone so successful always seemed to be working. Sammy's response was carefully crafted, polished by years of hiding the truth. He spoke about loving his craft, about never being able to stop performing. But his eyes told a different story. They were the eyes of a prisoner who had long since given up hope of escape. After the interview, the journalist wrote in her personal notes that she had never seen someone smile so widely while looking so utterly destroyed. The debt became Sammy's defining secret. He carried it everywhere, a weight that grew heavier with each passing year. It affected every decision, every relationship, every moment of his life. He couldn't trust anyone. Friends might be informants. Business partners might be mob associates testing his loyalty. Even family became complicated, as he feared his connections to dangerous people might put them at risk. The isolation was perhaps worse than the debt itself. Sammy had always been a social creature, someone who thrived in the company of others. But the mob had turned his greatest strength into a weakness, making every interaction a potential threat. By the mid-1970s, people close to Sammy noticed he had developed a peculiar habit. He would pause mid-conversation, as if listening for something only he could hear. His eyes would dart toward doors and windows, constantly checking for threats that never materialized, but felt eternally present. A doctor who treated him during this period later revealed that Sammy showed classic signs of severe anxiety and possible paranoia. But when the doctor suggested therapy, Sammy refused. He knew that talking to anyone about his real problems would be signing his own death warrant. The mob's control extended into the 1980s. Even as Sammy's health declined, even as his body began failing from decades of abuse, they continued to extract their pound of flesh. In 1985, Sammy was diagnosed with throat cancer, the disease that would eventually kill him. But even then, even facing his own mortality, he couldn't escape the debt. He was forced to continue performing through his cancer treatments. Weakened by chemotherapy, barely able to stand, he still took the stage because the men in the back room demanded it. Fellow performers were horrified. They watched Sammy, clearly dying, push himself beyond human limits because he had no choice. The debt had become more than financial. It had become existential, woven into the very fabric of his being. Frank Sinatra tried one last time to intervene. He offered to pay off whatever remained of Sammy's debt, to finally free his friend. But the mob refused. It had never really been about money. It was about power, about owning a legend, about proving that no one, no matter how famous or talented, was beyond their reach. In his final years, Sammy Davis Jr. became a tragic figure. The public still loved him, still celebrated his talent, but they had no idea of the hell he had endured for 3 decades. Close friends who visited him in his last months described a man at war with himself. Part of him was ready to let go, to finally escape the debt through death. But another part still fought, still performed, still tried to please the invisible masters who had controlled his life for so long. On May 16, 1990, Sammy Davis Jr. died at his home in Beverly Hills. He was 64 years old. The official cause of death was throat cancer. But those who knew the truth understood that Sammy had been dying for much longer, killed slowly by a debt that should never have existed. At his funeral, Frank Sinatra gave the eulogy. He spoke of Sammy's talent, his generosity, his spirit, but he also paused at one point, his voice breaking, and said something that confused most of the audience. He said that Sammy had paid every debt he ever owed, and more, that he had given everything he had to give. And then given even more, that no man should ever have to sacrifice as much as Sammy had sacrificed. Those who understood knew what Sinatra really meant. It was an acknowledgement of the secret Sammy had carried to his grave, a recognition of the invisible chains that had bound one of America's greatest entertainers for his entire adult life. After Sammy's death, investigators looking into mob activities in Las Vegas discovered something chilling. They found records, carefully hidden, documenting payments made by Sammy Davis Jr. over the years. The total amount was staggering, well over $5 million when adjusted for inflation. But here's what made it truly horrifying. The original debt, the one that had started everything in 1957, had been paid off completely by 1962. Everything Sammy gave them. After that, every dollar, every performance, every degrading compromise had been pure extortion. The mob had simply never told him. They let him believe he still owed them. Let him destroy himself trying to pay off a debt that no longer existed. One FBI agent who reviewed the files later said it was one of the cruelest things he had ever seen. They hadn't just stolen Sammy's money, they had stolen his life, his peace, his sense of self. All while he had no idea he was already free. The records were eventually sealed as part of various legal proceedings. The names of the specific mob members involved were redacted. Justice, such as it was, came too late to help Sammy Davis Jr. Today, when people remember Sammy Davis Jr., they remember the talent, the dancing, the singing, the charisma that lit up every stage he touched. They remember the Rat Pack, the movies, the legendary performances. But they don't remember the price. They don't know about the nights he couldn't sleep, the constant fear, the decades spent in invisible bondage. They don't know that one of America's most celebrated entertainers spent 30 years as a prisoner in plain sight. The younger generation discovers his performances on YouTube and marvels at his energy, his skill, his apparent joy. And that's perhaps the greatest tragedy of all, because that joy, which seems so genuine on screen, was often a performance within a performance, a mask worn to hide the screaming underneath. Some of his old friends still speak about him, usually with fondness and nostalgia, but occasionally, in unguarded moments, they reveal glimpses of the truth. They mention his nervousness, his drinking, the way his smile would sometimes freeze into something that looked more like a grimace. They talk about how he would sometimes stare off into space mid-conversation, lost in thoughts he could never share. How he would check over his shoulder, even when surrounded by friends. How he never seemed to truly relax, not even in his own home. The lesson of Sammy Davis Jr. Quote, "Sigid, hidden life is a dark one. It reveals that fame and talent are no protection against predators, that the bright lights of success can hide terrible shadows, that sometimes the people we celebrate most are the ones suffering most deeply." It also exposes the true nature of organized crime in Las Vegas during its golden age. The mob didn't just run casinos and skim profits, they owned people. They turned human beings into assets to be exploited, souls to be broken, and reformed into obedient servants. Sammy Davis Jr. was just one victim, but his story illuminates countless others, lesser-known performers, behind-the-scenes workers, people whose names never made the marquees but who suffered under the same system of control and exploitation. The Las Vegas that tourists see today, cleaned up and corporate, bears little resemblance to the dark kingdom of Sammy's era. But the ghosts remain in the showrooms where he once performed. In the hotels where he was once summoned to private meetings, the echoes of that suffering still linger. In the end, Sammy Davis Jr. paid a debt he never truly owed. He surrendered his freedom, his peace of mind, and ultimately his health to men who saw him as nothing more than a source of profit and control. He danced when his body screamed for rest. He smiled when his heart was breaking. He entertained millions while dying inside. All because one night in 1957, he walked into a casino and met men who understood that the cruelest chains are the ones you can't see. The world remembers him as a legend, but the truth is darker, sadder, and infinitely more tragic. Sammy Davis Jr. was a genius who spent his life imprisoned by invisible walls, paying an eternal price for a crime he didn't commit and a debt that existed only in the minds of his captors. And perhaps the most heartbreaking part of all is that he never knew he was already free. He died believing he still owed them something, still trying to satisfy men who could never be satisfied, still dancing on strings long after the puppeteers had walked away. That is the real story of Sammy Davis Jr., not just a tale of talent and triumph, but a tragedy of exploitation, control, and a debt that could never be escaped because it was never real to begin with.